On September 1, 1939, German soldiers pushed deep into Poland. Their goal was to win a fast and total victory. Just 20 years before this, their fathers and grandfathers had also been marching, but they were heading back home as a beaten army. Back in November 1918, after 4 long years of World War I, Germany's Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II was forced to give up his power. His armies were being worn down by a relentless attack from British, French, and US soldiers. At home, his people were starving. But a dangerous story was already starting to spread. The German generals and soldiers claimed they weren't actually beaten on the battlefield. Instead, they said they were betrayed by their own weak politicians. Still, at 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, World War I finally came to an end. The very next month, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson came to Europe. He promised to build a new and better world. He got the world's leaders to agree to a new group called the League of Nations. At the Treaty of Versailles, they all agreed on a new rule. From then on, arguments between countries would be solved by talking in the League, not by fighting. The people of Europe were freed. Germany's partner, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was broken apart. From its pieces, new countries were made: Austria, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Germany itself was also made much smaller. But this whole process created a ticking time bomb. Not everyone was happy about the creation of new countries like Czechoslovakia. Many of them had large groups of German people living inside their borders. Someday, the wish to bring all German people back together would become a huge problem for Europe. The German people, already hurt by the war, had to face one last shameful thing. They were forced to pay a huge amount of money, £6.6 billion, to France and Britain as payment for the war. It was money they simply didn't have. And when Wilson went back to America, his dream of a new world order quickly fell apart. The U.S. Congress decided it couldn't risk getting pulled into another European war. It refused to join his league, and the U.S. pulled back to focus only on its own problems. Germany was now a very different country. It was still the biggest country in Europe, but its military-focused monarchy was gone. It had become a democracy. But its government, called the Weimar Republic, was soon hit by one major problem after another. Street fights broke out between far-right nationalists and communists who were trying to start a revolution. Then in 1923, the country was wrecked by extreme inflation, which went up hundreds of % a month. The life savings of ordinary people were completely wiped out. This was the perfect situation for a new type of politician who could stir up a crowd. One of them was Adolf Hitler. Hitler was born in Austria. He had fought bravely as a soldier in World War I and had won the Iron Cross Medal. After the war, he moved to Munich. His powerful speeches soon helped him take control of the small National Socialist or Nazi Party. In October 1923, Hitler and his followers tried to take over the Weimar government with guns. It didn't work, and he was sent to prison for 9 months. In prison, he wrote a book, Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle. In it, he blamed Germany's problems on the Jews and said that Germany needed to rebuild its strength and take new lands in the East. When he got out of prison, he started to build the Nazis into a well-organized political party. From then on, he would use the democratic system to get power. But for the next 5 years, Weimar Germany did well. Support for extreme parties, on both the left and the right, went down. Then, all of a sudden, Hitler's big chance came. In October 1929, the U.S. stock market crashed. Billions of dollars were lost, and a huge economic crisis spread across the world. In Germany, the number of jobless people jumped to over 6 million. Only extreme politicians seemed to have an answer. Politicians like Hitler. By 1931, his Nazis had become a huge movement. They even had their own thugs in brown shirts, the SA Stormtroopers, who numbered almost 3 million. In the 1932 elections, the Nazis became the biggest party in Germany's parliament, the Reichstag. But Hitler refused to share power with other parties, which meant the parliament couldn't get anything done. To fix the gridlock, President Hindenburg made him chancellor in January 1933, making him the head of the government. Within a month, the Reichstag building burned down. Hitler blamed the communists and asked for emergency powers. He then used those powers to ban all other political parties. In August 1934, President Hindenburg died. Hitler then made himself president. He was now the total leader, the Führer of Germany. At first, there wasn't much sign of the terrible things to come. For the next 3 years, the Führer focused on rebuilding Germany's economy. He spent millions on public projects, like the 5,000-mile Autobahn highway system, to give jobs to the unemployed. But in secret, Hitler was also spending huge amounts of money on a massive program to build up the military. Under the Versailles Treaty, the German army was supposed to have only 100,000 men. The country wasn't allowed to have an air force, tanks, or submarines. This small army was made 3 times bigger. Then in 1935, Hitler stopped hiding his plans. He showed off a brand new air force, the Luftwaffe. It had 2,500 planes, which was way more than Britain or France had. The number of jobless people dropped, and the Nazis became extremely popular. Now, feeling more confident, the Führer made his first move to expand Germany's borders. In 1935, he took back the Saarland district on the French border after the people there voted to return to German rule from the League of Nations. A year later, he sent German soldiers into the Rhineland. This was a part of Germany that the Versailles Treaty said had to be free of military forces. At the time, many people felt that Hitler was just taking back what was Germany's anyway. Neither Britain nor France did anything to stop him. When Berlin hosted the 1936 Olympic Games, many saw the Nazis as a strong but fair government. A government that was giving the nation its pride back, and wasn't a threat to anyone. Of course, there were warning signs. The 1935 Nuremberg laws stopped Jews from marrying true Aryan Germans and took away their citizenship. But when the first real threats to world peace appeared, they didn't come from Hitler. They came from a completely different place. At the start of the 20th century, Japan was already a strong military nation. It had beaten Russia in a war in 1905, and it had fought with the Allies in World War I. After the war, Japan was seen as a world power, and it joined the League of Nations. But its politics were a mix of confusing ideas. It was supposed to be a democracy, but old traditions were still very strong. Most Japanese people honored their emperor as a living god, and saw him as their real leader. The country also had big economic problems. Its population was growing very fast, and it didn't have the natural materials to power its growing industries. Its leaders needed answers, and they saw them in a part of China called Manchuria. Manchuria was a land with rich fields of grain, and plenty of coal and minerals. It was a perfect target. Japanese soldiers were already stationed there. Other possible targets were the colonies run by European powers, Burma, Malaya, and Hong Kong, which were controlled by Britain, Indochina, ruled by France, and the Dutch East Indies. But at this point, Japan had to be careful. They didn't want to wake up the other great power in the Pacific, the United States. Even though the US spoke out against empires, it actually ran its own unofficial empire in the Pacific. The Philippines, Guam, and several other islands were under its direct control. It certainly had the power to fight Japan, but since the end of World War I, it had been busy with other things. This was America's Jazz Age. Through the 1920s, the nation focused on using its huge resources. It was an economic boom that seemed like it would never end. People made fortunes in both business and the stock market. America seemed lost in the search for more and more pleasure. With distractions like these, Japan's growing ambitions in the Pacific seemed very far away. America had cut its army way down after World War I and had agreed to a treaty to reduce its navy along with Britain, France, and Japan. This basically gave Japan control of the seas in the Pacific. And then came the Great Depression. As the economic disaster spread, a quarter of the American people lost their jobs. Tens of thousands became homeless and had to live in shacks. Before, America was distracted by pleasure. Now it was distracted by pain. It was time for Japan to make its move. In 1931, without even telling their own elected government, the Japanese forces in Manchuria captured the capital city of Mukden. Then they took over the rest of the area. A fake state, Manchukuo, was announced with a puppet ruler. Henry Puyi, the last emperor of China, who had been removed from power in 1911, was brought out of retirement. At its main office in Geneva, the League of Nations now faced its first big test. The whole world spoke out against Japan. But its answer was simple and direct. The Japanese just walked out, and the League suddenly realized there was nothing it could do about Manchuria. Japan was called an international outcast, but it didn't care. Its leaders had already set their sights on taking more of China. This was an easy target. China was in a state of chaos. The government of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek was in a fight with the Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong. There was a civil war. In 1936, before invading, the Japanese signed a deal with Hitler. The goal was to protect against any attack from Soviet Russia if it tried to move into China. Then in July 1937, the Japanese started a fight with Chinese soldiers and invaded. At first, the Chinese were caught by surprise, but they soon fought back hard. The Communists even joined with the Kuomintang to create a united front. The Japanese answered by landing soldiers on the coast. By the end of 1937, they had taken over much of northern China and the coast. The Japanese fought this war with extreme cruelty, bombing cities without caring who they hit. Western people living in the business center, the port of Shanghai, were now moved out. The city was then surrounded for 3 months. It suffered huge damage, as the Japanese forces showed no mercy or care for the local people. But it was after they captured Nanking, which was the Chinese capital at the time, on December 17, 1937, that Japanese soldiers really went wild. It's believed that over 300,000 civilians were killed during a 6-week period of rape and random killing. The Japanese even attacked British and U.S. warships that had been sent to protect their ships and trade. The worst event happened on December 12, 1937. The American gunboat Panay was sunk by Japanese bombers. 50 crew members died. Even after this, the Western powers refused to get involved, so the League of Nations could do nothing. In the United States, President Roosevelt wanted to use his navy to block Japan's ports, but the British refused, afraid that it might start a war. So all Roosevelt could do was offer a $25 million loan to Chiang Kai-shek to buy weapons. Even though the communists were now fighting with the Kuomintang, the Soviet Union didn't do much to help either. Its only action was a few small fights along its own border with Manchuria, but China itself got nothing. Instead, it had to fight on by itself. During 1938, the Japanese took over Canton and pushed the Chinese forces deeper into the western part of the country. All the talk from the League of Nations, all those promises to stop countries from attacking others, had meant nothing. And by now, the Western powers were facing attacks much closer to home. Today, it's easy to laugh at Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy. All that showing off seems a bit silly now, but it didn't seem that way in 1922. Back then, Italy looked like it was about to fall into total chaos. The country was full of strikes and people taking over land. The democratic government, just like in Germany, seemed powerless to stop all the trouble. So Benito Mussolini, a war veteran and a journalist, decided to do something. He organized a right-wing nationalist party, the Fascists. When the country was stopped by a massive strike in August 1922, Mussolini ordered his followers to march on Rome. Afraid of a civil war, Italy's king, Victor Emmanuel, asked him to form a government. Mussolini quickly got rid of all political enemies and took on the powers of a dictator. By 1928, his position seemed safe. The parliament was chosen by him, not elected, and all power was held by the fascist Grand Council. Like Hitler, Mussolini's first actions made him very popular. Huge public works projects gave people jobs and changed Italy's roads and buildings. He got rid of corruption and more or less wiped out the mafia. Italy's military was built up, including an advanced, modern air force. In the Mediterranean Sea, Mussolini built a powerful navy, bigger than the British and French Mediterranean fleets put together. When the Great Depression hit, Italy seemed to handle it better than most countries. Mussolini became an inspiration around the world. Political leaders, especially Adolf Hitler in Germany, saw the fascist system as a great example, strong and decisive, unlike the weak democracies in Britain and France. But Mussolini wanted more than just praise. He wanted to rebuild the Roman Empire, and he already had a place in mind for his first imperial land grab. His target was Abyssinia, which is today's Ethiopia. Italy already had colonies on its borders in Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. In December 1934, Italian forces started a fight with Abyssinian soldiers at an oasis in the Ogaden region, deep inside Abyssinian land. Mussolini then sent more soldiers to Eritrea and Italian Somaliland and demanded that Abyssinia pay for the damages. The Emperor of Abyssinia, Haile Selassie, went to the League of Nations himself to ask for help. He called on it to stand up for its beliefs. Here was a small nation being threatened by another member of the League. This was the biggest test yet. But the League did nothing. Britain's Foreign Minister, Anthony Eden, at least tried to make a peace deal, but Mussolini refused. In early October 1935, the Italian army invaded from Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. The basic Abyssinian forces had little chance against a modern army, with artillery and tanks. The Italian Air Force had complete control of the sky and attacked the Abyssinians, sometimes dropping gas bombs, even though gas had been banned at Versailles as a crime against humanity. After 6 months, Abyssinia was completely taken over. The Emperor Haile Selassie escaped to live in Britain. From its main office in Switzerland, the League of Nations just worried and did nothing. It did put some economic punishments in place, but they didn't really work. Mussolini's attack had shown two things. The League of Nations, that great hope for peace, was powerless, and both of Europe's so-called major powers, the democracies of Britain and France, no longer had the will to fight. Both Britain and France had been broken by World War I, and their economies had never truly gotten better. Both had seen many strikes and protests. Both had suffered from high unemployment, even before the Great Depression. Both also had to pay the costs of controlling their empires, which were now bigger after taking Germany's old colonies and the Middle Eastern lands once run by the Turkish Ottoman Empire. And most of all, both had been deeply hurt by the horrible number of deaths in World War I. A series of British leaders, Lloyd George, Ramsay MacDonald, and especially Stanley Baldwin, all decided to keep Britain out of any future wars. Despite the terrible losses on the Western Front, Britain had ended World War I with a large and very good army of drafted soldiers. This army was immediately cut down to a small professional force meant to police its large empire. And when the Great Depression hit, any ideas of making the army modern were dropped. This meant that Britain went into the period before the war weak, both economically and militarily. France's losses during World War I had been even worse than Britain's. Always suspicious of the Germans, they kept a large army of drafted soldiers. But through the 1920s, France's birth rate had dropped. It became clear that there would be a shortage of soldiers by the mid to late 1930s. France realized it could never match Germany's army size alone. The solution was to think only about defense. The Maginot Line, a series of forts, was started in 1930 along the border with Germany and went as far as the Belgian border. There, it was supposed to connect with forts planned by the Belgians. This new French military plan meant that France was only able to fight a defensive war. It just didn't have the power to launch an attack on Italy, even if the British had the soldiers to help. And of course, both countries knew that their navies in the Mediterranean were outnumbered by Mussolini's new fleet. So when Italy took over Abyssinia, it made sense for both powers to do nothing. It just seemed too far away, too much of someone else's problem. By now, they both had to deal with the pain of the Great Depression. That seemed much more important. And above all, they were now faced with a military threat much closer to home. A Germany that was rising again and building up its army. And Germany's power, along with Italy's, was soon going to be shown by supporting the rise of another dictator in Spain. In 1936, a civil war broke out in Spain. It was extremely brutal, turning family against family, communist against fascist, and religious people against non-believers. In 1931, a left-wing government had come to power, wanting to get rid of the old Spanish monarchy. The king was forced to leave the country, and a republic was created. In February 1936, the parties of the left joined together in a popular front to face the forces of the right in a general election. The Popular Front won by a small amount. Even though its plans for change were small, a wave of strikes and land takeovers made the right wing fear that a communist takeover was coming. Inside the Spanish army, which had long been a stronghold of conservative and Catholic ideas, senior officers began to think about a government takeover. One of them was General Francisco Franco, a former head of the army who had basically been sent away to command Spain's forces in the Canary Islands. On July 17, 1936, the army units fighting rebels in Spain's colony in Morocco rebelled. The next day, Franco flew to join them, announcing a new nationalist movement that would save Spain from communism. Garrisons on the mainland now joined this revolt. The Popular Front answered by asking for volunteers to defend the Republic. The lines of battle had been drawn. At first, Franco had problems. He and his army were in North Africa, and he had to get across the Straits of Gibraltar to get back to Spain. So he asked the one person he thought might help him, Adolf Hitler. Within a month, transport planes from Hitler's new Luftwaffe had started an airlift, flying Franco's experienced veterans over to southern Spain. At this stage, the Republic still seemed to have the upper hand. The pro-Franco military rebellions in Madrid and Barcelona were quickly stopped, leaving it in control of most of the eastern part of the country. Franco's nationalists were mostly stuck in the northwest and a part of the south. But the nationalist situation changed completely when Hitler and Mussolini started sending in soldiers and weapons. The German dictator used the chance to test his new equipment and growing military. The first panzer tanks were sent, along with about 12,000 soldiers. And the Luftwaffe sent its Condor Legion, with its very modern new bombers and fighters. Mussolini sent a so-called volunteer force of 50,000 men and more than 700 aircraft. The Republicans begged Britain, France, and the Soviet Union for help, but it was no use. London and Paris were scared of starting a European war. They announced a policy of not getting involved. Playing along, both Germany and Italy signed up for this policy. But when it became clear that they were still sending weapons to the nationalists, Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, announced that he would help the Republic. Stalin's worry was the rise of fascism in Germany. Hitler had made it very clear that he thought communism was Nazism's greatest enemy. Stalin saw the Spanish War as a way to keep Germany and Italy busy while he built up the Soviet Union's military power. About 700 military advisors were sent, along with tanks and fighter planes. It was something, but it was no match for the support Franco had received. In fact, the biggest source of outside help for the Republic didn't come from a country at all, but from volunteers, the international brigades. About 30,000 left-wing Americans, British, French, and Germans signed up to fight in Spain. With their new fascist support, the nationalists were able to open two fronts. One moved toward Barcelona from the north, and the other, led by Franco, pushed up toward Madrid from the south. By the end of 1936, Madrid was surrounded on three sides and was basically under attack. The fighting was fierce and often included terrible acts of cruelty against civilians. The Republicans hunted down and murdered Roman Catholic priests. The nationalists killed anyone they accused of being a communist. German and Italian air power was used without care against civilian targets. Madrid was heavily bombed. But the worst event happened in April 1937, when the Basque town of Guernica was almost completely destroyed, with 6,000 civilians killed. The area controlled by the Republic was slowly worn down. Its forces fought with great bravery, but untrained and poorly equipped amateurs were no match for the professional soldiers led by Franco, or for the combined modern weapons of Italy and Germany. As the war went on, the fighting around Madrid became a symbol of the left's fight to not be crushed by a fascist dictatorship. But behind the scenes, the Republican alliance was falling apart. The communists and socialists wanted to focus on winning a military victory. But the more idealistic anarchists and syndicalists saw the war as a chance for a mass revolution by the workers. These arguments exploded into the open in May 1937. Fighting broke out in Barcelona between the anarchists and communists. It was a deadly blow to the Republican cause. By the end of 1938, the nationalists had trapped their enemy in a small area around Barcelona and another area stretching from Madrid east to the coast. Madrid kept holding on, but the international brigades were pulled out. More and more nations started to accept Franco's government as his forces moved in for the final attack on Madrid. At the end of March 1939, its defenders were exhausted after almost 3 years of fighting, and the capital finally surrendered. A month later, Franco officially declared that the fighting was over. The scars of Spain's civil war took years to heal, and in some ways, they never have. And for the world, Franco's victory over the Republic was a disaster. Hitler and Mussolini were now sure that the democracies of Britain and France were powerless to stop any real pressure. At the same time, Stalin lost hope that they would ever stand up to fascism. Hitler, in particular, saw a clear path to begin the aggressive plans he had described in Mein Kampf. Even before the Spanish Civil War ended, his armies were on the move. From the moment he became Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933, Hitler had started to work on his long-term goals. On February 3rd, he told his top commanders that his final goal was to take over land in the east and cruelly Germanize it. They were told to get ready for a huge expansion. Although Germany was not allowed to have tanks, a secret deal with the Soviet Union in 1923 had allowed them to develop tank designs and test new ideas for mobile armored attacks. Young and energetic German officers like Heinz Guderian read the ideas of British thinkers like Basil Liddell Hart and Colonel John Fuller. They even watched drills carried out by the British during the 1920s. It was from these ideas that they came up with the concept of fast-moving units, mixing tanks, artillery, and infantry that could push fast and deep into enemy land. Hitler loved their ideas, The new army was to have 3 panzer divisions. In the same way, the new Air Force, the Luftwaffe, led by former World War I fighter pilot Hermann Göring, had a foundation to build on. During the years when its Air Force was officially banned, Germany had kept its design skills sharp by building civilian planes. And gliding and flying clubs created a pool of potential pilots. Hitler revealed the existence of the Luftwaffe in March 1935. He then announced that the army would be increased to 300,000 men, and that drafting soldiers would be brought back. Britain and France made weak protests about this obvious breaking of the Versailles Treaty, but soon they slowly and reluctantly began to build up their own armies again. Up to this point, Hitler had been careful with his goals. He had only taken back what was his, the Rhineland and Saarland. But now he had a bigger target in mind, his home country, Austria. In 1934, Austrian Nazis had tried to take power and join the country with Germany. The Austrians, after all, spoke German, even if they had never been part of a German nation. In February 1938, another Nazi plot was found. The Austrian Chancellor, Kurt von Schuschnigg, complained to Hitler. Hitler responded by demanding that Austria stop treating the Austrian Nazis badly and join with Germany. Schuschnigg quickly called for a public vote so that the Austrians could decide if they wanted to stay independent. But on March 12, 1938, the day before the vote, Hitler, afraid it might not go his way, sent in his troops. Complete surprise and a warm welcome from Nazi supporters made it a bloodless invasion. Within hours, Hitler announced that Austria was now part of the Third Reich. For the first time, a free nation had been absorbed into a greater Germany. Once again, the Western democracies did not act. In the summer of 1938, he turned to his next victim, Czechoslovakia. A large German minority lived in the northwest of the country, in an area known as the Sudetenland. These Sudeten Germans had been part of the old Austrian Empire, but had been cut off when Czechoslovakia was created in 1919. This was the time bomb that had started ticking when the Treaty of Versailles was signed. Hitler encouraged the Sudeten Germans to demand more control over their own affairs, and then threatened the Czech government with force if it refused. Not scared, the Czech government ordered a full mobilization of its army and got ready to fight back. The Czechoslovak army was large and had good equipment, with strong forts on its border with Germany. Hitler backed down. But then at the beginning of September, worried that war could break out at any moment, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain decided to try and make peace. He flew to meet Hitler twice. The Nazi dictator promised him that if he could have the Sudetenland, he would not ask for any more land in Europe. In Munich, on September 29, 1938, with Mussolini acting as the middleman, France and Britain signed a deal giving the Sudetenland to Germany. In return, Hitler gave a formal promise that he had no more plans to take territory. Chamberlain flew back to Britain, waving the piece of paper. He claimed it, quote, guarantees peace in our time. And so, on October 1st, German soldiers moved into the Sudetenland and seized the Czech border forts. Hitler now started looking at his next target, Poland. Again, the official reason was a German minority that was left behind because of the Versailles Treaty. Hitler demanded that the port of Danzig be returned to German control so that East Prussia could be connected to the rest of Germany. The Poles refused, and Hitler waited. He wasn't quite ready for a full-scale war, and he had unfinished business with Czechoslovakia. In March 1939, the eastern part of the country, Slovakia, which was culturally different from the Czech lands, asked Hitler for help to get more independence. Hitler called the Czechoslovak Prime Minister Emil Hacha to Berlin and bullied him into putting his country under German protection. German soldiers now marched into the rest of Czechoslovakia without a fight. Most of the country was added to the Reich. Slovakia was declared a protectorate. For the first time, Hitler had seized territory where people didn't speak German. But again, there was only a weak protest from Britain and France. At the end of March, he again repeated his demand that Poland give up Danzig. This time, France and Britain stated clearly that they would declare war if he attacked Poland. But by now, Hitler didn't care much if they did or not. He was sure they would be weak and unable to make a firm decision. In Russia, Stalin had also become more and more worried by Hitler's attacks. In April, Stalin suggested an alliance with Britain and France. But the talks didn't get very far. Finally, Stalin gave up hope and decided there was another way to deal with the German threat. On August 23rd, the Soviet Union and the Third Reich, who everyone thought were bitter enemies, announced a non-aggression pact. The agreement secretly said that Poland would be split between the two countries. and Stalin would be free to take over Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Now free from any threat from Russia, Hitler ordered his armed forces to get ready for an immediate invasion. On the evening of August 31st, the German Wehrmacht prepared for the attack. Its Führer had made the decision that would throw the world into war.